Now, I want to start off, if you'll allow me to read from you a scripture. It's from Psalms, not quite as short as the one Denny read, but only 6 verses, and that's Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all of the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, as Denny said, I was born and raised up in Suwannee County, Florida, which is up where 75 and 10 intersect, and then you head west about 23 miles, and you're there. I was raised in the First Methodist Church. My family regularly attended. We had a specific pew that my father would shepherd us to. My father, my mother, my sister, myself, and my 3 brothers. You'll probably find this hard to believe, but I was not the best behaved child in church. I might have actually been analogized to Dennis the Menace. I had this way of finding trouble where there was no trouble to find. And I recall my father had a very distinct way of clearing his throat to remind me that peace was to be preserved during the service, and there would be some consequence if I did not. When I was in college, I was hospitalized with pneumonia. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks. I didn't know it at the time, but I came that close to dying. I distinctly recall that while I was hospitalized, my father every evening would leave work, make the drive from Live Oak to Gainesville, approximately 85 to 90 miles. He would be there sitting in a chair when I went to sleep. He would be in that same chair when I woke up. He would let me know he loved me. And then he would make that trek back to Live Oak, work all day, only to be back by my side that evening. He was there every day that I was in the hospital. Shortly after I was released from the hospital, I turned 21 on April 4th, 1976. My family got me to come back to Live Oak, and they threw a little celebration. I recall my father telling me how proud he was of me. It was just a few days after that I got a call that my father had passed. It's not a case where he had been ill. It's not a case where he was expected. In fact, he was the same age when he died as I am today. He simply came home from work, lie down for a nap, and passed into glory, never to awaken and walk with the mortals he left behind again. I remember getting that call. And I was filled with rage. I was angry. I was mad. And I think part of that was that in the 3 weeks that we spent together, I came to know him. I came to bond with him in a way that we had not done for the entire 20 years of my existence. My father was a veteran of World War II. He was not a man of many words. He was not a man of emotion. He was what some would call stoic, as so many World War II veterans were known to be. But it was during the quiet time that he was simply there with his presence to assure me, to let me know that I would be okay. And I was mad. And who did I get mad at? I got mad at the big guy upstairs, God. I can't tell you to this day why I did. Maybe it was a convenient excuse to not go to church, to not continue with how I had been taught. But I got angry, very, very angry. Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't go out and run amok. I continued to lead a good life. I continued to treat people well. I followed the Ten Commandments. But I wasn't walking side by side with God. I wasn't allowing God's grace to envelop me, which, as I know today, is all important if you're going to have that close personal relationship with our Lord that you need to truly meet your potential as a Christian. October 1990, my brother John, also a major at that time in the Marine Corps, were about to ship out for the first Gulf War. My mother, who was a regular attendee still at the First Methodist Church, that although I'd been back in town about 8 months at that time, I had not been going, got a call from the pastor of the church, wanted to come see us. My mother asked me if that'd be okay, and out of deference to her, I said yes. But I'll be honest with you, I was guarded, because my first thought was, what does this guy want from me? I was prepared, I was girded for somebody to come in, a Bible-thumping, hell and brimstone, holy roller type, to hit me between the eyes with what was wrong with my life, what I needed to change, and why I needed to start attending church. If somebody like that had come in, like water off the back of a duck, it would have rolled right off with no saturation whatsoever. Instead, what I was greeted with was a quiet, unassuming, gentle man of God. Someone who came not to ask something of me, not to want something from me, but simply to assure myself and my brother, who were about to go into harm's way, about to leave our young families behind. My son Franklin at that time was 4. My wife Myung was pregnant with our daughter, Nicole, who had not yet been born. He just wanted to let us know, you go do what you got to do. Don't worry about those you love back here. Don't be distracted by the fact that you're separated. The church family will take care of them. Then the last thing he asked of me, he pulled out a little pocket Bible and asked me to take it and carry it with me. I told him I would. It's the only respectful thing I could do, right? The pastor asked me to do something, so yeah, I stuck it in my pocket. I carried it with me everywhere. I'm sure he wanted me to open it and read it regularly. I did not. Because as I had become convinced, or deluded myself, if you will, I didn't need God. I had a good life, had a beautiful wife, a bright, intelligent young son, a daughter on the way. I had no real needs that were not being met. And throughout my existence, even to this day on my 61st year, I was pretty much like that cat with 9 lives that would always land on his feet no matter what happened. I was born under a lucky star, if you will. I carried that Bible. The only time I actually took it out of the blouse pocket of my utilities was when I was changing uniforms from soiled to clean. And when I say soiled, I mean pretty doggone dirty. I'd take it out, I would look at it, I'd put it in the pocket, and that's where it would stay till I needed a clean uniform or had the chance to get a clean uniform again. Fast forward to 9/11/2001. Everybody remember where you were when you first got news of the terrorist attacks? I know I do. I remember my reaction seeing those airplanes fly into the Twin Towers, to see the airplane flying into the Pentagon, to see the location where the valiant passengers had sacrificed themselves to overpower the terrorists to save other innocent people. I recall seeing that charred remains of an airplane and the charred slide pattern where the plane had crashed. I remember marveling that they would have the intestinal fortitude to do something like that. While I was deployed for the first time in 2002, by the time I retired in 2010, I'd served an additional 6 combat tours. I want to share with you an experience I had during one of those tours in 2004. I was assigned to lead the Marine Forces Central Command coordination element. What that basically meant was that I was herding cats and fighting tar babies because I had 7 Marine units that were assigned to Army organizations. The Army had tactical control. I had administrative and logistical control, which meant I was responsible for all of their personnel issues, their pay issues, but most importantly, to make sure their logistical needs were met, which wasn't easy because the Army and the Marine Corps, although we had similar equipment, did not have the same logistics pipeline, and not all of the repair parts were identical. So I was constantly flying all over the country to make sure that my Marines that belonged to aviation elements, combat arms forces, and combat service support. There was one particular time that I flew out to meet up and check on the Marines of a bridging company that were attached to the Army in the vicinity of Mosul. Their job was to replace, there was no repairing it, they had to replace a bridge that had been blown up by a large truck bomb a couple of weeks prior. I flew in there on 2 April 2004, intending only to stay the day. I was slated to fly out on an Army Black Hawk later that afternoon. I wound up canceling that flight because there were things that needed my attention, things that needed to be done to make sure those Marines had what they needed. Early on the morning of 4 April 2004, which was my birthday, I was awakened to the sounds of explosions, small arms, and light machine gun fire. I had been sleeping in a bunker. Now, when I say bunker, it's not what you're thinking. It's just basically a hole with sandbags around it to protect you from direct and indirect fire. As I emerged from this hole, scrambling to put on my gear, I was blown off my feet by a nearby explosion. It was an eerie feeling. I was temporarily deafened. I couldn't hear anything. Everything honestly looked like it was in slow motion. I was trying to get to my feet. My arms wouldn't work. My feet wouldn't work. My knees wouldn't bend. And I got to tell you, I was afraid. I was also ashamed because Marines aren't supposed to know fear, and it was the first time in my existence as a Marine that I had known this level of fear. A fear that was so strong it literally paralyzed me. Seemed like hours. It was probably at best a matter of minutes. But just about when I had resigned myself to the fact that I was going to be a coward, I was going to allow fear to overwhelm me, a fear to not allow me to do my job, which was to lead Marines. I heard a voice. The voice said, "Get up, boy. Do your job." It was probably the only voice that I would listen to. That voice belonged to my father. I did get up, and I made a beeline for the closest fighting hole, and as I dove in unceremoniously, I landed on a young sailor. It was a Navy corpsman. I could see by the name tag on above his left breast pocket that his name was, I learned, as he pronounced it, Angeles. A-N-G-E-L-E-S. And as I landed on this young sailor, he broke into a speech pattern that, as Denny said, I won't share it with you today, but let me just say, he spoke it in only the way a professional sailor could. About that time, he saw the eagles on my collar, recognized I was the visiting colonel that everybody had been hearing about. He also saw that I was bleeding from my nose, my ears, and my forehead, and he started tending my wounds. He looked me in the eye and said these words. "You scared, sir?" I started to lie. I didn't want to admit that I was. I didn't want to admit that I was feeling more fear than I had ever experienced in my life. And I didn't see any fear in his eyes. And I said, "Yes, son, I'm a little afraid, but I think I'll get over it." And I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "I'm okay, sir. I'm just hoping none of my Marines get hurt." And you have to understand why a corpsman would say that. If you've ever experienced or seen the bond between a Marine and a corpsman assigned to the Fleet Marine Force, you would understand what I'm talking about. Those corpsmen go into harm's way with us where we are armed to the teeth, where we are allowed to offensively react, where we are allowed to, with withering fire, destroy our enemy. They're not allowed to be armed. It's against the Geneva Convention. But repeatedly over my years of service, I saw Navy corpsmen expose themselves to enemy fire, to go out and tend the wounded, to bravely bring them back to safety, and in some instances the corpsman was killed saving the Marine. So that's why when he says, "my Marines," it meant something to me. About as quickly as that happened, he was up and about, running from fighting hole to fighting hole, checking on his Marines. And as I directed the heavy machine gun fire and the company commander directed the air and artillery strikes on the enemy positions, I could see from the corners of my eye Angelus scurrying from hole to hole, checking on his Marines. Later that morning, as things started calming, the sun was just rising. There was a mixture of fog and smoke from all of the weapons that had been fired on both sides. And suddenly, Angelus was back in the hole with me. He was struggling to catch his breath because he had literally been on the move the entire time, running from hole to hole to check on his Marines. And he said, "You still scared, sir?" And I said, "Not so much." He said, "Watching you expose yourself, watching you run from hole to hole, watching you going out to see that our Marines were okay, inspired me and allowed me to overcome the fear." And without missing a beat, he said, "Wasn't me, sir, it was God." He said, "I learned long ago that if I let God control my life, if I let God take care of my life will take care of itself, and I really don't need to be afraid." Then he turned to me and says, "I think we ought to read from the Bible. You got one?" About that time, I remembered that Bible given to me in 1990 that was still in my left breast pocket, had not been opened, had not been read, had only been taken out to put it in the pocket of a fresh uniform when I could get one. So I took it out and gave it to him. He said, "I know just what to read." He opened the Bible, and he read from Psalms 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." As I listened to him read, a wave of peacefulness fell over me. It was at that moment that the clouds parted, if you will, and I realized I discovered what was truly missing in my life. What was missing, and I would never be a truly whole individual until it was there, and that was a close personal relationship with our God. It was at that moment that my faith was renewed, and I recommitted myself to be a true and faithful Christian. After he finished reading, Angelus said, "Got to go, sir. Got to go check on my Marines." And he disappeared. I never saw him again. I did try to search him out to thank him for what he had done, to allow me to find the strength to do what needed to be done. I couldn't find him. I checked with the company commander. No, sir, we don't have an Angelus. We got a Doc Jones and a Doc McCready. No, I'm sure it was Angelus. I left late on the evening of the 4th of April to fly back to Baghdad. There was a Army chaplain, Catholic priest that I had befriended. We met in a weekly poker game. We have become good friends. I shared with him the story that I just shared with you, and he was as intrigued as I. He said, maybe I can help you out. Work through the chaplaincy to find this corpsman. Came back a couple of days later and says, I've had no luck finding Doc Angelus. But I did learn something interesting. Angelus, spelled A-N-G-E-L-E-S, is of Greek origin. And the translating meaning is messenger, angel, messenger of God. Denny mentioned the four amigos, if you will, himself, myself, Stan Posey, and Frank Johnson. They've been fast friends of mine, and they are the ones that, quite frankly, when I returned from the first Gulf War, had gotten my wife going to church, and she requested I go, and out of deference I went, but I was there in body, but not really in spirit. But it was Libby McCullough, Gail Posey, Issa Johnson, had taken my wife into their group, and it was in part because we all had children about the same age, and that is the backstory on how we came to spend all of those many New Years together with the McCullough family. And I remember years back, Stan Posey came to me, said, I just saw a movie, you need to watch it. It was the newer version of The Count of Monte Cristo. It's the story of a young Frenchman who is wrongfully accused and wrongfully imprisoned for something he's innocent of. It's a story where his best friend betrayed him because he wanted his girlfriend. It's a story of the time that he spent in the Chateau d'If, which was a terrible, terrible prison on an island in the middle of nowhere. It's a story of his transformation. In the early parts of the movie, after he's in prison, he meets a monk who is also in prison in Chateau d'If. The monk becomes his friend. In fact, the monk becomes his mentor. And I recall a scene where they're having a conversation, and the monk refers to God, and that God will allow justice to prevail. Edmond Dantes, who became the Count of Monte Cristo, bluntly said, I no longer believe in God. The monk, without missing a beat, said, that's okay. God still believes in you. Now that young pastor, that quiet, unassuming, gentle man, that shepherd of God's flock who came into my life so many years ago in 1990 and planted a seed that was in, quite frankly, barren soil that no farmer worth his worth would have ever tried to till, fertilize, or plant, but planted a seed knowing that in God's own timeline it would grow and flourish. That pastor was none other than your pastor and my friend, Denny McCullough. He knew what I needed. He planted it, and it grew. For that, I am eternally in his debt. So as you walk out of here today, I want you to remember one thing. No matter what happens in your life, no matter how bad things get, and I've spoken to some people in the 3 times that I've spoken to this church that have had some bad things happen in their life. Don't go the easy way like I did. Don't turn your back on God. Don't let your anger overwhelm your relationship with God. Just remember, even when you stop believing in God, God still believes in you. No matter what, God believes in you.